Guten Morgen, Chag Sameach, everyone. We are talking tonight about what we call the rationale, reasons of the mitzvahs, what's called Tamei HaMitzvos. So, the first question I just want to address before we actually get to the meat of the class is the following. We find in many places that reasons for the mitzvahs should not play a part in our performance of the mitzvahs, the rationale. For example, at Seder, we said the following. There's a mitzvah, l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a mitzvah to talk about the Exodus, right? So, that means, ostensively, what's the purpose of that mitzvah? So, to inform yourselves and others about the Exodus, to look into the issue, to think about it, etc. If that's true, if I was a chacham, Navon, Zaken, and Yodea, if we were wise and we knew all about it and we were elderly, etc., and we knew the whole thing, should we have to talk about it at all? What for? We already know it. However, what do we say in the Haggadah? Afilu kulanu chachamim, even if we're all smart. Afilu kulanu nevonim, even if we all understand things. Kulanu zakenim, we're all elders. Kulanu yodim es Torah, we know the entire Torah. Nevertheless, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetzias Mitzrayim. It would still be a mitzvah for us to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. What does that seem to imply? That seems to imply that whether or not the reason is being fulfilled, whether or not this is following the reasoning of the mitzvah, it doesn't matter. You've got to do it anyway. And, we of course know that there are people who made some serious errors philosophically, which ended up as errors in practice about Judaism. For example, the early Reform movement took the view that if we can circumvent, we know the reason for this and this commandment, and if we can somehow fulfill the idea without worrying about the actual details, that's great. That is great. Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik has a fantastic essay about Korach and the rebellion of Korach, which he calls the common sense rebellion against Torah authority. And some of you may have read it. And what he says is the following. Korach's basic claim against Moses was that the mitzvahs don't make that much sense. What does he say to Moshe? Korach says to Moshe, listen, he says, how many threads of blue do you need on your tzitzis? Moshe Rabbeinu says, 1. So Korach says, I just bought a beautiful blue suit at Macy's. It's the colour of tcheles. They had it on special, right? And do I have to put threads on it? Moshe Rabbeinu says, yeah, it needs tzitzis, right? So Korah says, I don't understand it. If one thread of blue is enough to remind you of everything you need to be reminded of, surely an entire garment made of blue should be just as good. And then Korah asks Moses, what is else next? He says, let's say, how much do I need to put on the doorpost? How much of the Torah? Moshe Rabbeinu says, a mezuzah, 2 parshas of Shema, little tiny thing. So he says, let's say my whole house, I've got a library of 10,000 books. I'm a scribe. I write Torah scrolls. My house is stacked with Torah scrolls all over the place. I still need a mezuzah? What does Moshe Rabbeinu say? Totally. I don't know if he said totally, but he said yes, of course you do. So Korah says it doesn't make sense. Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik says the following. He says, you see, Korah's fundamental mistake was the following. He said he assumed that his understanding of the mitzvah is correct, and is the only idea behind that mitzvah, and his personal inspiration is that which is the sum total of the impact and the purpose of that mitzvah. And consequently, he said, if my personal inspiration comes from wearing blue tie-dyed garment, or from having my house full of sforim, or whatever it happens to be, he says that should be sufficient. He says, so Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik said, that's not how the Torah works. The Torah runs according to certain halachas. God prescribes certain things to do. The fact that my mind doesn't comprehend it is irrelevant. The fact that I come up with an idea may be a beautiful idea, but who's to say that's it? Who's to say that what I come up in my mind is what God had in his mind? How do you know? And he says, and third, he says, how do you know that your subjective feeling and inspiration is an objective reality? Maybe it's not. So he says, therefore, and this is but this Korach's rebellion was a very common feature throughout history. There were many people who said similar things. I don't understand the reason, so I don't have to do it. Or I feel I can accomplish the same goal as the mitzvah of kashrus by cooking the ham, right, very well, and hence I'll get rid of the trichinosis parasite, or whatever it happens to be, and that'll be great. So Rabbi Yoshe Ber says that is totally wrong. And so therefore, if that is true, also, one more point. Halachically speaking, if you do a mitzvah and you have no idea of any of the philosophy behind the mitzvah, have you fulfilled the mitzvah? 100%. 100%. You have no idea why you are refraining from this delicious looking lobster. No idea. Right? So it looks great. I mean, it doesn't look great, but let's say, right, you have no idea anything about Shabbos, but it doesn't matter. If you have to do what you have to do. So if so, that would appear to be a argument against looking into the rationale and the reasons for the commandments. However, given all of that, we have to understand that virtually all the Rishonim, whether it is the Ramban, Nachmanides, Maimonides, the Rambam, Rav Sa'ad Gaon, and many, many, many of the greatest of the Rishonim, the Abarbanel and others, and not only that, not only on the side of the philosophers, but the Kabbalists as well. Rabbi Menachem Rekanati of Italy wrote a book called Sefer Tamei HaMitzvos, the book of reasons for the commandments based on Kabbalah. In the Zohar, there's a section of the Zohar, we're going to run through the Zohar tomorrow, or Sunday, I forgot when, right? But the Zohar is a section, Raya Mehaimna, in which the Zohar offers reasons for commandments. The Rambam's third section of Guide for the Perplexed is full of reasons for all the commandments. Sefer HaChinuch, reasons for commandments. So, if all that we said is correct, why is it that... Did you just turn that on now? Is it?
No.
Okay, good. Okay. So, if that is true, why are they giving us all the reasons for the commandments? Why should we even bother? Why does Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch write an entire book, Chorev, explaining the reasons, the rationale, the philosophy of the mitzvahs? Why does the Rambam spend the whole third section of Moreh Nevuchim doing that? Why does the Ramban, Nachmanides, in his commentary on the Torah, at every opportunity, explain to us the idea, the rationale behind the commandment? So that's what we have to understand. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. Before I get to the halachic aspect, which is all I really wanted to talk about, before I get there, some of the reasons are the following. First of all, the term we use for reasons for the commandments is ta'amei ha-mitzvos. Ta'amei. So ta'am in Hebrew has two meanings, right? It means reason and it also means taste. The verse says in Tehillim, it says, ta'amu ura'u ki tov Hashem. Let's translate that. What does that mean? Ta'amu, taste. Ura'u, and see. Ki tov Hashem, that God is good. Taste and see that God is good. To quote exactly the words of my teacher, Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, Ze nishma k'mo pirsomet liglida. This sounds like an advertisement for ice cream. Taste and see, God is good. I mean, yeah, this is King David speaking, prophetically, in Tehillim. We say this all the time. So what is it talking about? So Rabbi Shapiro said the following. We have a rule, the Gemara says the following. La'olam ya'asok adam b'Torah mitzvahs. You should always engage in Torah and mitzvahs, af al pi shalol lishma. Even if you're doing it for the non-altruistic reasons. Why? Mitoch shalol lishma, balishma. Because from doing it for non-altruistic reasons, you'll eventually come to do it for altruistic reasons. So the first idea is motivational. The idea is that it is, let's say, if you think Shabbos is about relaxation, and that motivates you to keep Shabbos, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing. It could be eventually you'll discover there's much more to Shabbos than relaxation. Much more to it. Right? Relaxation is the surface of the experience. But if that's why you do it, you're doing a good thing. If the reason you are giving charity is because you feel guilty that the person's there, is that a good thing? Yeah, it's better that you should feel guilty and give charity and tzedakah than not give. Eventually, hopefully, you'll come to realize that it's a value in and of itself. We know that when it comes to children, motivating a child to do something like learning how to read, etc. So at some point, at the initial stage, you've got to offer an incentive. Right? You have to say, if you learn Aleph Beis, I'll give you this. So you give the kid incentive, they get the star, right? They get whatever, a tick on the refrigerator, they get some candy or whatever it is, right? But eventually, if a 17-year-old, is still saying, I'll read this book if you give me something, that's pathetic, isn't it? That's pathetic. Right? At a certain stage in life, the kid's got to realise that reading is valuable in and of itself. So, therefore, when it says, Tamu Ruki Tov Hashem, taste and see that Hashem is good, it's a way of saying, do the mitzvahs, even not for the ideal reason, just because God said so, because you understand something about it. Therefore, it is valuable to learn and study and investigate, as the Rambam puts it, to study and investigate the reasons for the commandments as a motivational factor to do them. That is number one. Number two is a little more important, I think. Number two is this, and this is, the Rambam quotes Reb Shimon ben Gamliel in the Sifri, and he explains it in the following way. He says, there are certain mitzvahs, this is based on Reb Brisker Rov's explanation of it, there are certain mitzvahs which we understand. The Torah comes along and tells me, don't steal. I understand that. Makes sense. Society could not function without these type of rules, social contract. Life would be nasty, brutish, and short, as... who was it? Hobbes put it, not the tiger, but the philosopher. Anyway, so it is so you need those type of rules. I totally understand that. Hashem comes along and tells me, don't wear your suit. Why? Because there's linen in the shoulder pads. And so, what? I don't understand that, right? So that's called a chok. So when I do a chok, when I fulfill a statute, it is an exercise in humility. It's an exercise in obedience. And ultimately, I have to be humble enough to have obedience to God, who has the moral authority to command me to do what He chooses. He created me, He sustains me, He has that right, He has that authority. However, most of the mitzvahs are not like shartners. Most of the mitzvahs, we can say, that makes sense. Even mitzvahs which are chokim sometimes make sense to us. We can understand that, So Shabbos, I understand that, makes sense. A lot of aspects of Pesach, I understand that. Now, why are certain mitzvahs given in a way that makes sense to me? So here the Brisker Rov says, and he's basing this on the Rambam, Maimonides, he says, so that part of the mitzvah is to inculcate into my personality a certain way of thinking, a certain level, a certain way of looking at the world. So that since this mitzvah comes with a rationale, Hashem wants me to think about the world in that way. So therefore, a second aspect of knowing the reasons for the mitzvahs is that those reasons, if they're accurate and they're Torah-based, will actually are lessons that are supposed to be learned, lessons that are supposed to be inculcated in myself from those mitzvahs. Is this clear? Makes sense so far? That is a number two aspect of what we call the Tamei HaMitzvahs. One more introductory remark. Rav Moshe Shapiro mentioned that he was very close to Rav Dessler, Rav Eliezer Dessler. When he was a teenager, he was related to Rav Dessler, and he lived in his house for a short time as a teenager. Lots of great stories about that. Anyway, so he was on the train with Rav Dessler, I think from Tel Aviv to Haifa, and Rav Dessler was going to give a shiur about Tamei HaMitzvahs, reasons for the mitzvahs. So Rav Moshe Shapiro asked, I don't understand, who are we? How can we have the chutzpah to offer a reason for a mitzvah? I don't know why my best friend does certain things. I can't get into his mind. How can I possibly imagine that I could get into God's mind and say, oh, that's why. I know. Right. How can you possibly do that? Solomon ibn Gvirol, the great Hebrew poet, he once put it this way, Ilu yadativ hayitiv. If I'd know him, I'd be him. But you can't know God unless you are God. You can't. Our mind is finite, can't wrap itself around the infinite. So the only way that it could do that is if it actually was infinite, which means it would be God. So obviously, if I would know him, I'd be him. Right? Understand? Right. So Rav Moshe Shapiro, as a teenager, said, "I understand, Rav Dessler. How could this be? How can the Rambam and others have the chut?" And some of the reasons are very, very pragmatic and just an example. You're probably familiar with the mitzvah of Egla Arufa. Egla arufa means basically the slaughtered calf. What does this mean? If a dead body is found in the land of Israel, they find someone who apparently has been murdered. They measure the distance from his body to the closest city, and the closest city has to have this ceremony in which the elders of the city, the Sanhedrin, the court, and all the people of the city go out to a dry riverbed outside the city, and they slaughter a calf as a sacrifice, and they declare, our hands did not shed this blood, and there's a whole atonement ceremony for the fact that a murder victim was found close to this city. People familiar with this? Okay. That's the mitzvah. Why? Maimonides, the Rambam, has a fascinating reason. He says, you know why? He says, because if everyone gets together outside the city, the whole crowd's milling around, he says they're doing this very dramatic ceremony, everyone is going to be talking about what? The murder. He says officers of the court are circulating amongst the crowd. He says the whole Sanhedrin, the court, is there. He says chances are they'll pick up some clues about the murder and will be able to solve the crime. That's the Rambam's explanation for Egla Rufa. A lot of others did not like that. They said this is way too prosaic. This is like something out of a murder mystery, right? It's something out of CSI Canaan or something. You know what? Are you kidding me? I mean, are you serious? Right, listen, let's get all the witnesses in the room together and we'll talk about it and we'll show them. Right, they have a light. That's what the Rambam says. So you can understand Rav Moshe Shapiro's surprise at how do you have the chutz? How can we do such a thing? That's why Hashem said it. That's the purpose. Are you telling me that's what Hashem had in mind? Yeah, we'll be able to figure out the murder this way. So Rav Dessler answered him the following. He said there are different words in Hebrew for reasons. One word in Hebrew for reason is siba. Siba. There's another word in Hebrew for reason, ilah. He says the word we use for reasons of the commandments are not siba or ilah. We use a word ta'amei hamitzvos. Ta'amei hamitzvos. Now he says ta'am, he says is the following. I'll quote the Yiddish. Probably about 50% of my knowledge of Yiddish is going to be in the following sentence. He says ta'amei hamitzvos, das is the geschmackkeit of the mitzvahs. I will translate. Right? The Tamei Mitzvahs is the taste, the Geschmackkeit. Geschmackkeit means, it's Geschmack. He says it's the taste of the mitzvahs. What does he mean? So Rav Dessler explained, he says this. When the Rambam comes along and offers the explanation for Egla Rufa as a means of getting clues about the murder, he's not claiming that's why God commanded it. What he's saying is, God commanded it for whatever reason, we have no idea. However, it is correct to say that a pleasant side benefit of the commandment is that we might find out who the murderer was. God did not command us to keep Shabbos because he wants us to relax. It's not what it says in the Torah. Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim reminds us of the Exodus. Zeichel Amaisa Bereshis reminds us of creation. But when the Rambam comes along and says that what wealthy person, politician, leader can spend a sixth of their life in leisure, like Jews do. We do that, right? 1/7 is Shabbos, right? Add the Yom Tov together, it's a sixth of your life. He says, how many people like that? I mean, maybe there are presidents, if you measure the amount of golf per there have been surveys about that, I don't know. But basically, right, he says, it's awesome. 1/6 of your life, leisure, enjoying, eating, drinking, etc., etc. I don't think the Dessler at least says, he says the Rambam is not claiming that's what God had in mind when he commanded us to keep Shabbos. What he is claiming is one of the pleasant side benefits of Shabbos, Geschmackkeit of Shabbos, is leisure. Leisure. It's not always intuitively obvious. I had a student of mine at Or Samach in Israel. After the 7-week summer program, we were sitting around, elder guys sitting around. It's the end of the summer program, 7 weeks of intense learning of Torah and touring of Israel, and everyone was asked to give a comment about the program. So this one guy gets up and he says, dude, this orthodoxy really cuts into your leisure time. his comment on 7 weeks of magnificent philosophy and mysticism and stuff cuts into your... But he's right. It does cut into your leisure time. Right? Hard to say that. Here we are at the hotel, just had a steak dinner, we're going to have a concert soon, we'll have a snack at the tea room in the middle, so whatever. But nevertheless, what he's saying is geschmackheit. And that's what it means by taste. Because you see, when you eat food, I know this is going to sound weird here at Gateways, but really, the reason we eat food is in order to survive. I know this may come as a shock, right? We eat food in order to survive. However, Hashem made food with many pleasant side benefits. What are the pleasant side benefits of food? It tastes good, it looks good, smells good, etc. So that's what we call the geschmackheit of the food. But the food itself is, I need it to survive. In the same way, the mitzvahs are there because they are our spiritual survival, our spiritual sustenance. They keep the soul intact. They keep the soul connected to God. Right? It's a life-giving, life-sustaining system. However, it is not given to us in an unpleasant fashion. It is given with side benefits. There's a geschmackheit. So yeah, of course, keeping Shabbos could be self-flagellation, right? And there was that, I don't know if anyone remembers the Da Vinci Code, right? Remember those guys, the Christian group who used to tie on these bands with spikes onto their legs and arms. They still do it today. Who was it? I forgot who they were. No?
Opus Dei.
Yeah, Opus Dei. I remember I was on a plane to Australia at the same time that the Da Vinci Code came out. It's a movie, and it features these Christian Catholic group called Opus Dei, who involve themselves in lots of self-torture, which I have no objection to as long as they keep it to themselves. It's when they start with the Inquisition stuff, then it gets her. Right, so anyway, they were showing it. I was on Qantas. They were actually showing it on the plane. One of the movies available on the plane, it's a 15-hour flight, so there's lots of movies, right? So one of them was that. So I get up to put on tefillin. We're somewhere over the Pacific. I'm checking it's dawn. I put on tefillin. This lady next to me, as I pull up my sleeve and take this leather strap, put it on my arm, she's looking at me with horror, expecting blood to be spurting out, spikes. It's like, oh my God, he's one of these Opus Dei whack jobs. So I saw her looking at me. I said, I couldn't speak because I'm putting on. He said, oh my God, he's really crazy, right? So, however, the fact is that Hashem gave us mitzvahs which, on the whole, are quite pleasant. There are many pleasant side benefits to them. That's what we call, so that's Rav Dessler says, that's what we mean by geschmackheit of the mitzvahs. I.e., tam ha-mitzvah is not the reason that God gave this mitzvah. It's not the cause and the mitzvah is the effect. Rather, it is actually the effect of the mitzvah as opposed to the cause. Exactly the opposite. When we talk about tam ha-mitzvah, normally I say reason for something. I mean, this is the cause of this effect. When I talk about tam ha-mitzvahs, reasons for I mean the exact opposite. I mean, this is an effect caused by the mitzvah. Does this make sense so far? Okay. So now, given that is so, we now understand, to a certain degree, a very famous argument in the Talmud between two of the authors of the Mishnah, two of the Tanoim, and the question is the following: Do we look at the reason for a commandment, and can we ever use the reason to modify the commandment? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says the classic case they talk about is the following. Classic case is this. If you lend money to a widow, widow generally at those times certainly was usually poor, you lend her money. Now when you lend someone money, you take security. So you take security from someone. So let's say as security you want to take her fur coat. She's got a fur coat, you take that as security. Are you allowed to do that? The Torah says, no, you may not take the clothing of a widow as security for the loan. Why not? The Torah does not say why not. The Torah says, don't take clothing from the widow as security for a loan. Lo tachbol beged almana. Now, Rav Yehuda says, you're not allowed to. End of story, period. He says, Rav Yehuda says, even if she is wealthy, let's say the widow is Jacqueline Onassis. Okay, she's a multi-billionaire, and for some bizarre reason she's borrowing money from Rabbi Becher. I can't imagine the scenario in which this would actually happen, but let's say, right? And also I find out she's Jewish, but whatever, okay, either way, right? So I'm sure you can come up with some. So now, it's probably going to be a plot for a story in Hamodia next week. So anyway, it's like, right, what at the end of the page? So he found out she's Jewish. And then, okay. So now, right, I'm not allowed to take her fur coat as security for the loan, even if she's fabulously wealthy. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Shimon says, not so. Rav Shimon says, look, the whole reason you cannot take her clothing as security for a loan is because, look, since she's poor, you need to return the clothing to her every night so that she'll have the warmth of the clothing. So how does it look for some guy to be walking into this widow's house every evening with a fur coat and picking it up in the morning? That is going to destroy her reputation, right? And he says it's not appropriate to do that. He says, therefore, however, if she's rich, you don't have to return the clothing to her. She's got hundreds of fur coats. It's like saying, oh, Imelda Marcus is missing some shoes. Oh, big deal, right? Right? Donald Trump is missing a building, right? The Maharishi is missing a Rolls Royce, right? Whatever it happens to be, right? They've got thousands of them. It makes no difference to her. So therefore, I wouldn't need to worry about it. So now, that is a fascinating argument. What that means is, and this the Gemara calls Dorshin Taima Dekra, an Ein Dorshin. Rabbi Yehuda would say, we do not utilize the reason for the mitzvah to modify the mitzvah. Rav Shimon says we can use the reason to modify the mitzvah. As you can imagine, Rav Shimon is quite risky. Isn't it risky? Because you can imagine the risk here, right? For example, King Solomon, the Gemara says, stumbled in this very issue. He said, I know, the Torah says I cannot have a lot of wives. But I know why. Because so many wives, kings would marry women from many different nationalities to form political alliances. In the case of Shlomo Melech, there was also a motivation to inculcate these nations with Torah by forming the alliance. He says, I know, the Torah says don't marry many wives. Even, you're a king, you cannot marry. Why? He says, because they will turn your heart away from God. So King Solomon said, I already know the issue, I will avoid it. The Gemara says you cannot be smarter than God. And what happened was, it says, in his old age, they turned his heart away from God. So therefore, that's the risk in the view of Reb Shimon. That's the risk. And it appears at least, that we paskin, meaning halachic norm, is in accordance with the view of Rabbi Yehuda, that we do not follow the reasoning of a verse in order to modify the mitzvah. Even if I figure out this is the reason for the mitzvah, I cannot use it to modify it. But there are some exceptions, and some very interesting exceptions. I'll give you the first one is not so interesting, but I find it interesting, but you may not. Okay. But that's too bad, I'm giving class. So the first one is the following. We know that you are not allowed to offer an animal as a sacrifice if it's under 8 days old. People might be familiar with this. It says, Shivas Yamim Tachazim, he shall be 7 days with his mother. Uvayom Hashmini Vahala, from the 8th day onwards, Yeiratzeh, only then he shall be accepted as a sacrifice. So the Torah says clearly, you cannot bring an animal as a sacrifice if it's under 8 days old. Okay? The Torah does not say why. The Torah does not give a reason for this. However, the reason is given in the Talmud. What's the reason the Talmud gives? Because since it's very difficult to track the pregnancy term of most animals, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, it's sometimes difficult to track humans, right? The doctor says, oh yeah, you're due now. And then 3 weeks later, what the heck, what's going on? Right? So with an animal, with a cow, it's very difficult. So now, problem is this, if the cow did not carry its calf to a full-term pregnancy, what that means, that's called a safek nefel. That animal may be considered not a viable birth. And you don't really know that it's a viable animal and it's a healthy birth until it survives for 8 days. With a human being, the amount of days that you know that is what? 30 days. That's why when we redeem a firstborn, pidyon haben, it is done on the 30th day. So now, like this. Let's say the owner of this cow is a veterinarian. Okay? And he's tracked exactly the gestation period of this cow. He knows 100% that this animal was born after, I think cows are 9 months, I have no clue, but let's suggest that Dale? 5 months? Thank you. Okay, so the cow's gestation period is 5 months, right? So let's say I've tracked it exactly 5 months. Exactly 5 months. I know for sure, in fact, it was even late. It was even late. So now I know this animal, this young calf, is 100% fine. Do I have to wait till the 8th day to sacrifice it? What would you say, folks? Yes. I'd say I have to wait. Because why? Ein dorshin time and we don't use the reason to modify the law. The Torah didn't say that reason. The Torah just said, don't bring it if it's under 8 days old. End of story. However, let me tell you a fascinating halacha. Are you allowed to eat an animal if it's under 8 days old? We're talking about sacrifices now. We don't have sacrifices today. Is this law still relevant to us? Yes, it is. You cannot shecht an animal to eat it if it's under 8 days old. Why? Same reason. Exactly the same reason. The Torah doesn't say this, but we understand that because the reason is that under 8 days old, it may be considered not a viable living animal. So if I shecht it under 8 days old, I might be eating something which is what we call treif. Is this clear so far? However, here the Rambam tells me, if I was able to track the pregnancy, and we know that this animal was carried a full-term pregnancy by its mother, Bessie, or whatever, right? Etc. Then what happens is, I'm allowed to eat it even under 8 days old. I'm allowed to eat it under 8 days old. Now, can anyone explain me what the difference is? If I want to bring a sacrifice under 8 days old, I cannot do so even if I know it was a full-term pregnancy. If I want to eat the animal under 8 days old, I'm allowed to do so if I know it's a full-term pregnancy. What's the difference? Okay, I'm giving you 10 seconds. Right, what?
By eating it, maybe you're saving your life, but...
No, we're not talking about a case. We're not talking about saving life. We're just talking about regular eating. You know, it doesn't require pikuach nefesh. I could eat a pig, a roast suckling pig on Yom Kippur that falls on Shabbos with a cream sauce. If I needed that to save my life in the unlikely scenario, right? But again, that's not what we're talking about, right? So one answer given is the following: the Torah never said you cannot eat an animal under 8 days old. The Torah never said such a thing. The Torah said you cannot sacrifice an animal under 8 days old. When the Torah says don't sacrifice it under 8 days old, no reasoning that I give for that can modify or change what the Torah said. But why don't we eat an animal under 8 days old? Why? Because we figured out from the Torah that it makes sense not to eat it under 8 days old, because the reason is that it might be treif. So if the whole reasoning comes from us, we can use the reasoning to permit it. In the same way that we use the reasoning to forbid it, we can use the reasoning to permit it. There's an expression you may have heard, hapesha asar, the mouth that forbade, hu hapesha hitir, is the mouth that permitted it. Okay? So, or, as the famous Italian expression goes, I make it the game, I make it the rules. Right? So if the prohibition against eating it is of a human origin, but we figured it out from the Torah, that same way we figured out the prohibition, we can figure out the permission. But when it comes to a sacrifice, it's not because we figured this out. The Torah explicitly says, don't do it. So if the Torah says don't do it, we don't do it. So it's not really an exception, such a case, is it? So let me give you two cases where the reason makes a big difference. You've all heard of the mitzvah of kan tzipor, shiluach hakain. A bird, you're walking along in the forest, you're hiking in the Canadian Rockies, okay? And you say, and you're walking along, right, yodely, or whatever you'd say in Canada, right? And and you are hungry, you want breakfast, and you see a bird's nest. And you see a bird's nest. There's no baby seals. There's a bird's nest. Okay, right? So you see the bird's nest. We climb up the tree, and there's a mother bird sitting on the bird's nest. Before you, what are you supposed to do? What's the mitzvah here? Shoo them. Take the mother bird, throw it, shoo her away, and then take the eggs. Lotikach. You're not allowed to take the mother and the eggs. Say, oh, it's great. We'll have the mother for supper. We'll have the eggs for breakfast. Everything is great. It's awesome, right? You can't do that. You cannot do that. You've got to shoo away the mother to take the eggs. Okay? Everyone's heard of that. Fine. Now let me ask you the following question. Right? You're living in Monsey, and an email goes around, there's a bird's nest at the Goldberg's house. I was like, oh, really? Right, that's awesome. So what happens in Monsey and in Brooklyn and everywhere else? A line of 200 people forms up outside the Goldberg's house. Nebuch, the poor bird in the nest, has got hundreds of from people waiting, right? They shoo away the mother, they take the eggs. They put the eggs back. Next person climbs up the ladder, shoos away the mother, takes the eggs, put the eggs back. Next person climbs up, shoos away the mother. Right, Nebuch, right? The mother bird is shooed away 500 times. And that's it. So are you supposed to do that or not? Not clear cut. In other words, is this mitzvah only true when I want the egg? In other words, if I need or want the egg, I can only take it if I shoo away the mother bird. But what if I don't want the egg at all? I'm not interested in eating bird's eggs from some bird's nest. Ugh, right? It grosses me out. Right? On the other hand, right, who knows when I'm going to be able to do this mitzvah? So I say, cool. The Goldberg got a bird, right? The bird's in their house. They are mafkir. They declared it ownerless, so therefore they don't really own the property, whatever. And somehow I climb up the ladder, and I don't want the bird. I don't want the egg, but I want to do the mitzvah. So should I do it or not? So this is a huge argument, actually, amongst the poskim. Well, we get into that. That's the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room is the following: what is the reason for this mitzvah? So that is not at all, the Torah does not say what the reason for this mitzvah is. The Torah just says, don't take the mother and the eggs. So some authorities say the reason for the mitzvah is, you should never destroy both the source and the product simultaneously. Destruction of the source, the mother, and the product, the egg, simultaneously is tantamount to destroying a species. And we do not want to do that. You want to take the product, take the eggs, shoo away the mother. You want to take the source, take the mother, leave the eggs. Don't take them both. Very beautiful. It's a conservation concept, right? It's don't destroy, it's a sefer chinuch, don't destroy a species. That's one reason. The other reason given for it, the Nachmanides, Rambam discuss this. I won't go into the subtleties of the distinction here, but they say, you know what? The mother experiences terrible emotional pain when it sees, so therefore, to take the eggs when the mother's there, no, you've got to shoo away the mother so she doesn't have the tsar, balei chaim, the pain. And the Rambam says animals, he says, feel pain physically, but he says, you know what, they also feel emotional pain. He says, you don't need intelligence to feel emotional pain. It's not a product of IQ. The animal has an instinct for its young. The animal has an instinct, and therefore I am causing pain. So those are two reasons: conservation and sensitivity to the suffering of an animal. Some say to grab the mother because she's hovering over the eggs is a cruelty because you're taking advantage of the motherly instinct in order to get the mother and the eggs. So I take the egg, the mother's obviously going to hover over to protect it, I grab, gotcha. So how cruel is that? To take advantage of this motherly instinct in order to take both of them? Not appropriate. Now, if that is the reason for the mitzvah, does it make any sense whatsoever to go to the Goldberg's house in Monsey and line up with 200 people to shoo away the mother bird? You're doing the exact opposite of the mitzvah. You are increasing the pain to the animal. Tsar balei. But that's not the only reason. The Kabbalists, based on the Zohar, the reason they give for this mitzvah is actually the exact opposite. They say what we want to do here is arouse the pain of the mother. We want the mother to fly around chirping in pain for its children that are gone, in order to inspire prayer and mercy of the divine presence that is flying around crying for its children who are in exile, the Jewish people. By arousing the pain and arousing the mother bird into flying around and crying for her lost children, her lost eggs, it evokes the memory in us of Rachel mevaka al baneha ki enenu. She cries for her children because they have gone into exile. Now, if you follow the reason of the Kabbalist, would it make sense to shoo away the mother bird if you don't want the eggs? Total sense. And on the contrary, the more people who do it, the better. So really, it's interesting to note there are authorities who differ about this particular mitzvah, but partially some of the argument as to whether it applies, or rather whether it's obligatory in this situation or not, hinges a little bit on the reason for the commandment. So that's a case where the reason for the commandment really does play an important role. Personally, I lean towards the Tsar Balei idea, and personally I would not, I wouldn't do it, right? Generally, I can't, promise that, but I lean towards that. Yeah.
This only applies to birds, and then perhaps also to
correct.
So what about wild mammals and reptiles? So you're going to say that it only applies to birds and not to others. So it sort of goes in the direction that we don't really know what we're doing. We're just doing mitzvah, and you can't really generalize and say it must be because it's a Becher, because doesn't that also apply to?
It's a good point. In general, the poskim say that Tsar Balei Chayim prohibition, the prohibition of causing pain to an animal, generally only applies to what they call domesticatable animals or mammals and stuff like that. But they give a reason that there's a sense to that, because they say this: animals that are more similar and closer to the human being anatomically and sometimes emotionally and physically closer to us, etc. It requires greater cruelty to cause pain to a warm-blooded mammal with fur and big eyes that lives in the house or that lives in the field, etc., than to a tarantula or a shark. Granted, you're right. I'm just pointing out that it would apply to the mammal type things that are similar to us, that we have that. But secondly, and then the Arizal and others say, this is actually cited in the commentaries on Shulchan Aruch, they say that certainly it's an appropriate character trait not to do this to any animal, whether it's kosher, treif, wild, domesticated, a reptile or anything else, because the Pasuk says, V'rachamav al kol ma'asav, God's mercy is upon all his creatures. So, since animals are here ultimately for the purpose of the human being, we are allowed to utilize the animals. But the poskim say we should always, even with non-kosher animals, the herd of tigers, whatever it is, always try to minimize the pain that we're causing. But you're right, to a certain degree, and the Rambam does say this in Guide for the Perplexed, he says we can never fully understand a mitzvah, ever. There are always going to be some detail we just can't explain. And he says it's futile to try to explain every single detail of every mitzvah. We can't do it. It's not going to be possible. Okay, now let me give you one more mitzvah in which there's a radical modification of the mitzvah, which seems to be totally based on the reason for the mitzvah, which is the last mitzvah in the entire Torah, mitzvah number 613. What is mitzvah 613? You have to write a Sefer Torah. I was once at a bar mitzvah of a fellow by the name of the son of a doctor, I think his name was Frovine, who was a professor of mathematics at Hebrew University. When he retired, he learnt Safrus, how to be a scribe, and he wrote a Torah scroll. It took him, I think, 2 years. He wrote it to fulfill this, wrote a Torah scroll, and the Torah scroll was ready for the bar mitzvah of his 9th or 10th son. So there was a minyan of Frovines in Bayit Vagan at the shul, and the kid who's becoming bar mitzvah is reading the Torah from a Sefer Torah that his father wrote. Could you imagine anything more beautiful than that? It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And here, what better fulfillment of the mitzvah of writing a Torah scroll could there be? So according to the Rosh, he has not fulfilled the mitzvah. What? Rabbeinu Asher, the great authority from Germany who moved to Toledo, Spain, and became the rabbi, one of the great rabbinic authorities of Spain, and his son wrote the predecessor of the Code of Jewish Law known as the Torah, and so many of our laws. He says, you know what? It's all very nice emotionally. It's wonderful, great, right? Definitely better than the cruise to Alaska, etc. Better than the trip to Universal Studios. Certainly, this is a bar mitzvah, this is how a bar mitzvah should be. But the mitzvah of writing a Torah scroll, I don't think he's fulfilled. Why not? Answer is this. Because, does anyone here learn Torah from a Torah scroll? Anyone? Yeah, you see people come to shul, let's learn. They open up the Vayiv and Saharon, they open up the Torah, and they're sitting there with the Torah scroll. No one that I know learns Torah from a Torah scroll. You don't see Rabbonim opening up, I have these distant relatives who, when I came back from yeshiva in Israel, they asked me, so did you go to the yeshiva in Jerusalem? I said, yeah, I went to the yeshiva. Right, and they said, so what's it like? Does the rabbi sit there with a Torah scroll and everyone's sitting on the floor and he's reading to you from it? This was their image of the yeshiva, right? The rabbi's got a Torah scroll, we're sitting on the ground in our kaftans, right, in the madrasa, right, and he's reading to us from the Torah scroll. Right? No, it does not happen. Right, we don't learn. So the Rosh, and actually numerous authorities say the following. Nowadays, this sounds almost reform. This smacks of heresy. They say the following. Now, all that mitzvah to write a Torah scroll, that was then. Nowadays, the mitzvah is to write, purchase, and obtain the books from which we learn Torah. So if everyone here, if you have a Chumash with Rashi, you have a Chumash Rashi at home, probably, right? Pirkei Avos, right? Rambam Mishnah Torah, Gateway to Judaism, right, etc. If you have the essential, central, fundamental text of Judaism in your home, like Gateway to Judaism, just as a random example, then you have fulfilled the mitzvah of writing the Torah scroll. Because that is the book from which you learn. But if you have a magnificent Torah scroll, which you spent $40,000 on, you got a Sefer who went to the mikveh every time he wrote God's name, right? And he used he flew to Tibet to get a quill from this type of bird, and unbelievable, right? And this guy is meditates on it every day, and he wrote this out, and it's $50,000, and the whole thing is made from the skin of a fetus of a calf that was never touched by human. Unbelievable, right? So he would say, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. Very nice, it's right, emotionally it's beautiful, but you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah because no one learns from that. That's pretty radical. So how could that be? How could you say such a thing? So first of all, I should point out, some of the authorities interpret his words, not that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah if you write it, not that you have to buy books or write books instead of a Torah scroll, but in addition to a Torah scroll, you also have to have the books from which you learn. If you only have a Torah scroll, that's not enough. You also have to have books from which you learn. But there are those who interpret this in a radical way, apparently, which is that the entire mitzvah of writing a Torah scroll has been replaced by the mitzvah of writing, obtaining, and owning books from which we learn. How could such a thing be? So some would say, well, it's an example of Rav Shimon. Dorshim, we are actually expounding the verse and saying this is the reason. But you see, the Lubavitcher Rebbe points out something which is pretty obvious, but he says this, in Likutei Sichos, he says, look, he says, in the verse, it actually tells you the reason. We didn't make up this reason. It's not from conjecture or guesswork or philosophy. The Torah says, what does the Torah say? Ve'ata now, kisvu lachem es hashira hazois, write for yourself this song, lomdo es bnei Yisrael, teach it to the Jewish people, sima b'fihem, place it in their mouths. So he says, when the Torah explicitly states the reason, he says, how could you ignore it? How could you say, you're right, okay, the Torah says teach it to the Jews, place it in your mouths, but you know what, it's better just to have a Torah scroll. No, the Rabbi says, when the Torah, if the whole argument is when the Torah doesn't give the reason, the Torah doesn't give any reason, then we are at liberty to say, you cannot use the reason to modify the verse. But if the Torah itself, God said, write a Torah scroll so that you can learn from it. And I say, well, very nice, I don't learn from it, but I'm going to write the Torah scroll anyway. So I think Hashem would say, excuse me, you only heard the first part of the sentence, you didn't hear the second part of the sentence? The second part of the sentence says, teach it, learn from it. And therefore, but today there is, even to this very day, a major argument amongst halachic authorities whether or not writing a Torah scroll, of course, all the fundraising campaigns would kill me if they heard this speech. Right? Contribute $1 to the Sefer Torah of this rabbi, that rabbi. Of course, it's but the fact of the matter is, many authorities say that it's not sufficient. Writing a Torah scroll is just not going to do it because you haven't really fulfilled what the Torah actually said. And so therefore we actually have a number of cases where we actually do use the reason in the verse and have modified the halacha. Case number one, we eat animals even though they're under 8 days old, as long as we know it was a full-term pregnancy. Number one. Is that an exception or not? Unclear. Right, number two, right, as I said, there are many authorities who say, do not, if you don't want the eggs, leave the bird alone. Right? Let it live. Right? Leave it alone. Of course, others say, no, on the contrary, we want to arouse that mercy so God will take us out of the exile. And this is a form of prayer almost to arouse the mercy of the mother bird. And third is the writing of a Torah scroll where we say it is far, virtually all poskim say that it is far more important to have the books from which you learn than to actually write a Torah scroll. And some say if you didn't ever write a Torah scroll your entire life, but you wrote, purchased, obtained, right, not stolen, but wrote, purchased or obtained those books from which we learn, then yes, you have actually fulfilled the mitzvah. I think if you'd ask your local Orthodox rabbi, as in all these things, I'm just giving a class here, what you do in your practice, in your own lives, is the type of thing you should consult with whatever your halachic authority is. I'm not really paskening a halacha here, I'm just giving you some of the ideas behind it, hopefully to enlighten us in some of the aspects where the Gemara discusses this very beautiful idea of tamei hamitzvos, the reason for the commandments. We encourage people to learn these reasons, as I said, number one, as motivational, number two, to modify the way we think and feel and personality by inculcating the ideas into our lives. Number four, by understanding that there is a geschmackkeit, there are impacts and effects of each mitzvah, even if the mitzvah itself is done because God tells me to do it because it's life-giving. And then we have the idea of whether or not we use a reason to modify the mitzvah, and we see that even though on the whole we don't, there are certainly cases where it certainly comes in to play in a halachic and practical discussion of the mitzvah. I'll just end with a statement made by Rav Yitzchak Ze'ev Soloveitchik, who says the following. He says that when it comes to the future, he says, in the same way, you know, it's interesting, the Rashi tells us that Avram Avinu ate matzah. Lot ate matzah. How does matzah make any sense? The Jews weren't even in Egypt yet, let alone got out. He says the answer is, for them it was a chok. It was a mitzvah beyond understanding, but they knew there was such a thing, it's a mitzvah to do that. He says, when Jews who were still keeping that tradition, when the Exodus came along, what happened? The Jews said, oh, that's what, now that makes sense. Now I understand the mitzvah. So he says, you know what? In the times of the Mashiach, when the Mashiach comes, when we have the future redemption speedily in our days, we'll probably be able to look at a whole bunch of mitzvahs and say, like at the end of a mystery novel, the butler, that was, oh my gosh, that's why it was a bread knife. The whole was, right, we'll be able to look back here and look back at all these mitzvahs and say, that's why sharpness, that's etc. Something will happen, events will happen that will make it all clear to us. But until that time, we do them if we don't understand them. However, we are always encouraged to study them and to try and get some level of understanding. Thank you very much for listening, and a Chag Sameach to everyone.